Hello friends and gamers, and welcome to my second video in the JX36 overhaul for Global War 1936 version 2. So this is a system of house rules put into place to overlay on top of Global War 1936 version 2. It is not endorsed by Historical Board Gaming. It has nothing to do with it. It's something I made completely independently. Any coincidences of similarities between version 3 and this expansion is purely a coincidence. Great ideas rise to the top. That's the idea behind that. So that's the scoop behind that. And the reason I put this out there is for the community to read and understand kind of what I wrote years ago. And perhaps they may develop their own house rules from it and expand upon them and make this the better and better game. So we all know Global War 1936 is a fantastic, fun game, but you know, it's a game in progress as well. And as if any game in progress, as it develops, it gets better and better over time. The more complexity you add into there, the more flavor you add into it, the more wiggle room there is to find kind of gray areas within the rules. So this rule set, the Overhaul, JX36 Overhaul, is version 0.8. So it didn't actually get released in any major way where I wanted the public to have access to it. But it's something I made just for fun, for my own playtesting group, and we played it 2 times, I think, before life just got busy, right? That's the idea behind it. So it's got its own share of bugs and features behind it, and I'm not denying that, and I will, it's also in hiatus, so I'm not going to actually fix anything that you guys suggest I should, but it's something that may it serve to inspire you for your own house rules and that type of thing. All right, so page 2, we're looking at the Great Britain reference sheet for this. So page 2, here we go. What does page 2 entail for us? Well, we have a few things on here that we could tackle, but we're going to leave this dynamic air war for a little bit, because that's a whole subject on its own self. Not worth dealing with right now. Turn phases we're also going to leave for a little bit and tackle something simpler first. So we have over here victory point scoring. We'll look at the victory points, ignore this lower thing just for now. It's best if I walk you through it. So the victory points are going to be pretty standard as what we had in version 2. Maintain the empire, hold all original starting territories, Mediterranean security, have twice as many capital ships, or hold on to Gibraltar, Malta, and Suez. So I think that's roughly the same. Royal Navy, have more surface warships than any other nation. So I added this as an added victory conditions because other nations have more victory conditions as well. British transit ports, this might be the same as the other one, but we also have an addition of here. This is a holdover from World War I. The Falkland Islands was a coaling stop, so they're on there. Ceylon is on there as well. It was quite important in World War II as well. So these are kind of transit ports, right, where things of import are moving around. Contain fascism is standard, and contain communism is standard. Now, other nations, specifically the French and the Italians are a good example because the Italians can actually join the Allies in this. You know, say for instance, Germany doesn't go and annex Austria and Bohemia, so that will actually drift the Italians. It may push the Italians to join the Allied side of things. You know, that's just the way the rules were written. Or there's other options too, that even if Italy joins the Axis, there could still be a civil war which will overthrow the fascist regime, and it could be communist or it could be democratic. And so in those 2 cases, you could have victory points that some would be for, you know, fascist regime, some would be for, you know, say democratic regime, and some for communism. But Great Britain, since it's been such a democratic nation forever, it has no option really I didn't give it any victory points for any of the other sides. It's just too big. Too big to fail, let's call it that. Okay, that takes care of all that. Let's look at what the first little house rule of import here, delayed deployment of production. Now this one could be considered controversial. So let me preface it by saying this. This game, JX36, has 3 turns per year. In addition to that, it reduces the amount of turns it needs to make ships. Now we saw that in version 3. It only has 3 stages of building a battleship. In this game, it's also 3 stages of building a battleship. Just coincidentally seemed to work out that way. So delayed deployment of production. In order to speed up gameplay, all construction and units, barring militia, supplies, and partisans, purchased at the production phase of one turn are not placed until the resolution phase of the following turn. Instead of the needs of the moment, players build more for the needs of the war, taking less time to decide. This also works well with the added turn per year. So the concept there is that say for instance, in the traditional vanilla Global War 1936, version 2 and version 3, you can really predict your opponent's moves quite well. Or not predict it, but you can really compensate for your opponent's moves. You know, Germany moves its entire force from Western Germany to Belgium. Well, don't worry, it's got some units it's building, and they're going to be placed in Western Germany to just secure it from attack. You know, Germany builds 2 transports or some aircraft that could carry airborne. Not to worry, on the British turn, we're going to compensate for that and build some units to protect from an invasion. Basically, it's one which you can really see your movements and see what you need to produce. Now, my thinking was, what would happen if you kind of got away from that meticulous kind of like, okay, so this turn I'm going to attack here, so I'll need this to back it up, so on the following turn I could attack there. And really that mathematical planning of staging your production in such a way to really compensate for your opponents and your own moves. So I think what I came up with was this. If you build more for the needs of the war, that means that, you know, if you delay your production by 1 turn, that means that each turn you're going to be building a little bit of everything. You're going to be building some infantry each turn, some aircraft, and maybe some ships each turn. And that way, you're going to have like the set build that you'll end up doing and producing from your factories, you know, stuff that will be coming out. And it'll take a little while for something unique to come down the pipeline as well. You know, if you decide to build something, well, say, oh, now you have this exploit. Sorry about that. Now you have some exploit of, oh, you see an opening in a chink in your enemy's armor. Now you're going to start building, you know, these medium tanks. Well, you know, that's taking advantage of the lack of fog of war. So with fog of war kind of included in this game with this delayed production, you kind of don't know what to expect. Each turn might be different from the next one. You don't know what your enemy's factories are producing. You don't know if they just plunk down 3 transports, and therefore you're going to be building kind of a set amount of units each turn. Some infantry, some aircraft, maybe a ship or 2, that kind of thing. Now we have this bird's eye view in vanilla Global War 36 where we see everything all at once. This is to kind of get away from that bird's eye view, and you kind of build in anticipation a little bit further down the line so you can't take advantage of those individual times of right now. That's the idea behind that. And the hope was to speed up gameplay, to make it that people don't spend time thinking about, oh, okay, this turn I'm going to build this, and this turn I'm going to build that. You just build something, and it's not going to matter too much because next turn is when you'll deal with it. So that's what all this is about. It also works in regards to technology. You research tech, and it doesn't matter because you're going to, the following turn, you're going to build your next production, that kind of thing. So it won't be immediate. You can always plan your turn already. So that's the scoop behind this, the turn phases. You research technology, you order next turn's production, and deploy previous turn's production on the resolution phase. You also collect income from territories, industry, politics, and technology, and generate partisans. So that's the biggest difference between the two. Okay, so that deals with delayed deployment of production. Next up, we have the shipping base hopping rule. Kind of, I don't like the fact that there's 2 ings in that, but shipping, basing, hopping, ruling, I don't know. Every unit may send troops across the globe to any friendly territory from and to any naval base. It means that you can move things a lot quicker. The number of units capable of being sent from a region is equal to the amount of naval bases in the region. The moving unit must connect to a friendly naval base within every 5th sea zone, but cannot exceed the limit. So the idea here is, if each turn is to represent 4 months, you know, as an example, the Titanic crossed the Atlantic, or almost crossed the Atlantic, I guess that's accurate to say. It didn't finish, did it? So technically it's still en route. No, theoretically, it was planned to cross the Atlantic in what? Under 2 weeks? Was it 9 days? It wasn't that much. It was the fastest at that time, and we're talking about 1912 or whatever it was. This is World War II. Things move a lot quicker. So instead of 9 days, I mean, even if it took 2 weeks to get across, that's 2 weeks out of 6 months in the vanilla rules, or 2 weeks out of 4 months in these rules. So I thought things should move a lot quicker. Version 3, Global War 36, came out with this strategic naval move where you can move transports a distance of 5 sea zones. Now, coincidentally, we came up with the same value, 5 sea zones, but the reasoning there is because it's 5 sea zones between London or Liverpool and Egypt, that kind of thing. Everything is roughly spaced out 5 sea zones, the big ones anyways. So that's the concept there, move things a little bit of a distance. So my thinking is, what if you're not using your military specifically built for the Navy transports? What if you're using more cargo ships and transport ships, just like the more commercial kind of stuff? Even if it's commandeered by the military, what if you're using this kind of stuff? There should still be sufficient movement capacity to force areas from naval base. So that's what was included here. You can move to and from naval bases. So from Canada, you can move a unit, and it can work its way all the way to Anzac territory, because that's what in 4 months it can theoretically get there. 30,000 infantry. Why not get to Sydney? But the trick is you have to go hopping from naval bases. So you have to hop from, say, Halifax, and you have to hop to Liverpool, and hop down to Gibraltar, and hop down to, Aden, and hop from Aden to Sydney, if it range, or Ceylon to Sydney. And therefore you can get that unit all the way down there, hopping your way there. Now, of course, there's going to be times when you're going to be blocked from doing that by enemy ships and that kind of thing, so you won't be able to hop. It'll be a little bit more difficult to hop to that point. But I think this accurately simulates what strategic naval moving could be. This predates version 3, though, so this is kind of the concept I had back in the day of how to overcome this, and I thought it worked quite handily. So the amount of units you're able to send is equal to the amount of naval bases. Keep in mind, in version 2, you only had 2 types of naval bases, or 3, I guess. You have a submarine base, you had a naval port, and a shipyard. So those are the only 3 types. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 if you include dry docks, 7, 8, 9, 10. You have 10 if you include the 4 submarine types, I believe. I may be wrong on that one. But you have quite a bunch more, so the world is more populated with naval bases. So this is what I came up with back in the day. To get stuff across the globe quicker, it was more historical. Now, that could have some negative impact on the game, but the fact you can't send too many units, the amount of units you could send from Halifax was 1, because it's got 1 naval base. You could hop it all the way down there. Now, so there's, in my mind, this might still be worth debating a little bit, because you have to connect to a friendly naval base every 5th sea zone. Does that mean you use the capacity of that naval base that you're connecting through, or not? So this doesn't answer that, and that's why I say it has gray areas in these rules. Like I said, it's not even ready for releases. JX36 0.8 not quite ready for release, but it could be shifted either way as needed, either helter-skelter across the map or not much at all. It also adds things too where certain nations won't be able to do so as easily. Germany won't be able to send a unit from where it's at all the way to Japan because they don't have sufficient naval bases in between. But the positive side of that is you could still send it also encourages grabbing up those island territories in the Pacific to hop your American troops, like the island hopping that was done in the Pacific campaign. It also encourages that by grabbing islands that have ports and such. You could hop your troops a little bit further on to reinforce those kind of naval bases that are secured from enemies. That's the idea behind that. So, okay, that deals with that. So you'd still only be able to send 2 units from San Francisco if it's got 2 bases, all the way to, say, Formosa or whatever, but you wouldn't get beyond that, beyond 2, because there's really only going to be a limited amount of places you can grab from. That's the idea there. And looking at it now, I'd probably say you can't, every friendly naval base, you cannot exceed the limit, even by hopping from those naval bases. So I think that seems a logical look at that. Okay, that's it for those 2 house rules. This page is full of house rules, so let's dive into the next one. I don't want to give away too much. Contested territory is the next one. When maximum combat rounds, that's something that's a new feature in JX36. Certain terrain have different levels of combat rounds you can fight, and other terrain have practically unlimited. And then weather also has an impact on combat and also time of the year. So you'll have a wet season and 2 drier seasons in a 3-turn per year game. And so that's kind of the idea, that 1 quarter will encompass like the wet season with winter months and rain and such, and the other 2 will encompass more the drier, easy to fight times. When maximum combat rounds for a territory is reached, conclude the combat and all route units remain in place. If you remember Axis and Allies 1914, this is one feature I quite liked about it. No nation could collect income from that too, and that was quite nice. Well done. Forces may reinforce or withdraw in non-combat movement without re-engaging in combat. So that means if you have a contested territory and you start that turn contested, you could withdraw from that contested territory without re-engaging. And you could also reinforce without re-engaging in combat. A contested army, so a contested amount of ground units, may detach units in combat to combat in the territory, and if victorious, continue to attack into the next territory. So I wish I had a way to draw this out, which I do. Let's see. So say you have a contested territory encompassed within this, and you have your forces and you have the enemy forces. Now, in 1914, Axis and Allies 1914, we had this issue where, say the enemy came in force, and you wiped you out down to, say, 3 units, right? Happy face. Yeah, 3 units left over. You could withdraw 2 of those units out and leave 1 unit left behind to keep that territory contested. If you withdrew the last unit, then you would be left with, then the enemy would start in a contested territory and would have to waste their turn wiping out that last guy. If you removed all units, then they could go ahead and attack you the following turn in the next territory. So you'd leave 1 unit and tactically kind of withdraw. So this here, because we don't want to freeze it up into 1914 style, this army here can detach, say if there's 1 enemy left, you can detach 3 units, 4 units, and if victorious, move the rest of the bulk of the army into the next territory. So this predates the screening forces that World War 1936 version 3 introduced, which a fantastic rule. I think much of the community had a hand in that, and that's awesome, fantastic, well done. So yeah, that's the idea behind that. So we're not locked up in a World War I-esque type of war. Okay, so that's what it says. If victorious, if the screening force is victorious, the regular army can move on past and attack the next territory. Nothing barring trenches may be built in a contested territory, nor IPP collected by either side, and you can't build anything else, or you can't even use the straits there. Basically, only trenches can be built. Trenches aren't good, but they're a little bit good. Okay, trenches negate infantry. They have a malice to the attack of the attacking infantry of a -1. Malice is the opposite of bonus. Malice means a negative feature, let's say, right? So in that case, if you had 3 units left over on the defending side and they built a trench, well, the infantry on this side would be suffering a -1. But all the other stuff, like their tanks, their artillery, everything else can just move on past, attack at full combat rates. So, and it's only for 1 round, 2 trenches. That's the idea. Okay, next up, Army and Navy units versus air units. Now, this one here is a bit more difficult to explain, but let's go with it. For each aircraft performing tactical bombing against Navy units, 2 Army or Navy units may return fire at anti-aircraft values. So in this game we have attack values, defense values, anti-aircraft values, artillery shooting values, that kind of thing. So you'll have a different value for defense or attack against aircraft. May return fire at anti-aircraft values against the bombing aircraft at the expense of participating in a round of naval or ground fire. This represents bombing localized to a narrow front or sea zone. Let me quickly talk about this bombing aircraft. If you have a few aircraft, and 2 of them are bombing, and then you have 3 fighters that are engaging in a dogfight with say some French fighters, these ones up here not going to be in range of any of the ground units down here, any of the defensive ground units. They're definitely not going to be in range of anything. So there should be no reason that these ground units here, whether they're anti-aircraft or not, can sufficiently impede the air battle, the dogfight way up in the sky. Now, aircraft in this game has been changed quite a bit, and aircraft is massive. So aircraft have been reduced in their capabilities, but equally reduced in their combat abilities as well, roughly split in half for fighters. Fighters against other aircraft roll at a 6, but fighters against naval units, 1. Fighters against ground units, a 2. Very minimal, right? Their primary purpose is to hit aircraft. Now, that means they have a much more dynamic and interesting air war, but we'll deal with that later on. That's almost a huge subject on its own. So the idea there is the defensive units can only fire at the attacking or bombing aircraft. Now, how many can fire? Well, my thinking is when you have an Air Force attacking, and the Air Force, it's not attacking the entire front. Like, they're not going to go expend all their ammunition all the way there. They're not going to have sufficient ammunition to go all along, a 40-kilometer front, just bombing directly there. They're going to kind of do crossways attack like this. That was our thinking with this. Or just very concentrated on a narrow front, maybe pass it 2 or 3 times along that same little section. So you're not going to have your entire force along that 30 or 40 or 50 kilometer stretch being able to fire back. So we calculate that it would be roughly 2 units for every bombing aircraft could return fire at anti-aircraft values. 2 units, naval or otherwise, can return fire. Everything else, it just sits there. It sits on his butt. That's it. But keep in mind that aircraft have been completely changed around. So this system, though it may seem absurd, it works really well. And this feature has been extensively play tested. I would say at least 8 times, 10 times, something like that, in Axis and Allies, as well as Global War 1936, quite successfully. It's one of those features that I have some friends now that insist on playing it this way, even in Axis and Allies, just because they think it's a fantastic way. I have another video I want to or have made. I think either I've made it and made it private, or I made it and I need to publicize it, about how Axis and Allies lifted their aircraft from classical Axis and Allies. Global War 36 lifted their aircraft from Axis and Allies, and so it's kind of like this old you know the word, octogenarian type of system that needs to be improved and updated to the much more better map that Global War 36 has to offer, with more territories and more uniqueness. Okay, so bombing represents bombing localized to a narrow front or sea zone. You're not engaging the entire Navy. You might just selectively target a few outreaches. Say if one figurine of a destroyer represents 30, well, you're not attacking all 30 at once. You might be targeting 2 or 3, and the ones that have smoke pouring out of them anyways, right? That kind of thing. You're not going after all of them all at once across 6 months. Here's another feature. If any military force consists of only aircraft, combat is limited to 1 round before the Air Force withdraws. This makes sense to us to kind of surfing aircraft. It makes sense because like Pearl Harbor, they should have thrown in a second, third, fourth, whatever. They should have kept on pressing their attack, but limitation of time, fuel, risk, that kind of thing. Air Forces generally, if it's specifically only aircraft, it was usually engaged with 1 round of combat across 6 months or 4 months in this case, right? It wasn't an extensive procedure where your naval units helplessly sit in the water as they're bombed to oblivion. It's usually very direct, precise, passionate, short-term durations of combat. That's the idea there. I didn't explain this feature quite well, but it works. It works good. It works good. You would have to have combined arms to extend that combat a little bit further. For instance, having navies included. So if you have your U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy, and they both engage, then combat is unlimited. You can go as long as you like. But if it's just strictly Japanese aircraft against Pearl Harbor, 1 round is all you get. That's the idea behind that. Now, if the Japanese carriers had moved in closer with the battle fleet, well then, yeah, they could have battled it out to the bitter end. Peacetime naval intent. Now, this one's pretty simple. When at peace, each nation is allowed 1 surface warship per major sea or ocean, which means Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Lower Atlantic or Northern Atlantic, Central Atlantic, Southern Atlantic, that kind of thing, in a flag-showing mission. That means nothing. The flag-showing mission is just you get to have your ship out there. There's no special missions for them. All other surface warships must be directly off the coast of the controlling nation's territory or anywhere on the shortest route between 2 controlled coastal or island territories. So the reason this is included is I've won some games against the Soviets when I had my British force, or sorry, my Soviet, what am I saying? My German force sitting off the coast of Scotland. From Scotland, I could hit Murmansk and use my second impulse to get into Moscow before, under my suggestion, they fixed it and split that 1 territory into 2 territories, which that's when I worked for HPG, and I was really glad they included that. So I could use 2 impulses to get into Moscow that way. Another way is I've invaded Paris from the sea. In my first impulse, I land, and second impulse, I get into Paris. Fantastic, right? Another way is putting pressure on Britain. Britain as well would work to some degree. You make a landing in what's now known as British Midlands, and your second attack goes into the city south. So Germany has no reason to be in that sea zone. It really has no reason to be in the North Sea. Even if they're saying it's some sort of mission, of flag-showing mission or training exercise, the training exercise is accounted for with this flag-showing mission, right? Everything else has to be directly off the coast of controlling nation's territory. Another example I've seen is where you had the entire Japanese force moving in the direction of, say, Iran or something like that. Well, you don't want that either. So you want nations to be directly off the coast of the controlling nation's territory or anywhere on the shortest route between. So that's the idea there. It's the benefit of nations who have colonies like the Allies, the Italians. You're in a position where you could be anywhere between those two. And even the USA, it has to be directly there. You can't move the US fleet. I know there's other limitations too, but you can't move the US fleet off the coast of, Sydney or something like that, right? Still have to obey these rules. All Navy units are still subject to operational range, which is another feature. You could only operate a certain distance, and dynamic supply rules, and suffer appropriate penalties. We'll deal with that shortly. Let's go on. Now, you may think this is all a little bit much, but like I say, I do this for everybody's benefit if they want to house rule some of their own stuff. Withdrawing and surrendering. So my thinking was, especially with navies, why would a navy just sit there and be bombed to oblivion? Don't you have some sort of maneuverability to kind of get away from battle? And likewise, weren't there some great retreats conducted by the Soviets perhaps, and the Germans perhaps? There should be some way of disengaging from combat. So, but there should also be some punishment for that. Any force may withdraw from battle. Units, any force, that means air force, land force, naval force, attacking and defending. Units execute withdrawal from battle after completing one round of combat in which both attacker and defender units roll their combat value halved, round up. So let me pause this for a second. I debated, what if just the defender unit roll half their combat value? I was like, well, that seems to really penalize the defender quite a bit. Okay, what if the attacker and defender, does that work out? Well, usually if the defender wants to retreat, he's usually outgunned by the attacker. If the defender has a hope to hold on to that territory, he's going to hold on to that territory. So the defender's only going to choose to retreat when it's advantageous to do it. So he's still going to have, say, half or 3/4 of the units that the attacker has. So he will still take collectively more punishment than the attacker will if we have the combat value. Additionally, a person can say, if this is too powerful, we could say tanks don't get halved. They have the movement. If they have sufficient movement, you could even say if they haven't used their blitz, they have sufficient movement to chase after and keep on pressing in that attack at full combat values. And that would work quite handily as well. So that was my thinking behind this. The defender and the attacker both roll their combat value halved. Possible exception be things with sufficient movement to go blitz or sufficient move left. Neither party can be denied a withdrawal unless it is amphibious assault or the defending force is surrounded. So that's, well, you get it. Once announced, withdrawals must be carried out regardless of roll results. So if the defender rolls really well and wipes out much of the attacker force, well, he still has to retreat. If defending army units roll 11 or 12 in withdrawal, the unit is considered overrun and surrenders, becoming captured equipment or POW worth 1 IPP at factory. Okay, so the idea there is you're having units, the attacking forces are trying to engage and the defending forces are trying to disengage. And one of the ways of trying to disengage is to leaving kind of rear guard action to hold up the enemy. And so that explains for me the combat value halved. You're not functioning as efficiently. It also explains this here, the idea of you're suffering an 11 or 12 and potentially having your stuff encircled and captured. That's the idea. Pocketed in like encircling movements and captured. Now, captured equipment doesn't necessarily mean that's the idea behind it. You're capturing, artillery. You're capturing whatever else. There's a lot of German units that were using captured equipment. There's a lot of German units that were using captured equipment. So I think it should be possible. Now they can't function that efficiently. If you have breakdowns, well, where are you going to get replacements? Do you have the right ammunition to fit into those captured equipment? Artillery pieces, same thing, munitions, right? What else do you need? Well, fuel perhaps, all this kind of stuff. All the equipment, all the parts and pieces, it's not that much worth it compared to other stuff, right? You have to have a lot of spare captured equipment to make it worth your while. So the idea is if you capture that, it's taken off the board, and that really benefits the attacker too, to kind of counter this half combat value. The defending army unit have the chance of being encircled as they withdraw, and actually benefit the attacker. So at that point, you're going to replace the defending unit with a credit token with POW or captured equipment. like POW, ignore that. That's the only token I had available, but it captured equipment and shuffled off to a factory. Now, what gets a little bit interesting too is, what if it's a ship? Can you capture ships? Well, you bomb them to bits, basically, right? So in the case of ships, they're not overrun necessarily. They're caught up with, and maybe the attacking forces scored lucky hits and kind of damaged some of the enemy retreating forces, and the enemy retreating forces, now the rudder's broken or whatever, the engine's blown, and now they're captured equipment. So even capturing ships would not be that easy, because the defending forces, the Americans and the Japanese, oftentimes they'd rather sink their vessels, pull the cork essentially at the bottom of the ship and let it sink, jump into lifeboats. So it's not going to be that much worth it to anybody. There might be some salvageable stuff, and so that's why there's still one IPP. You don't get the captured ship, because a ship again would represent like 30 odd destroyers. You just get one IPP, and the rest of it were sunk to the bottom of the waves. So that's the idea there, to kind of tilt the balance the other way in favor of the attacker, so the defender does not always want to retreat. Now, what about partisans, uprising, and civil wars next? So this is some feature that I wanted to add into the game, because you could include partisans across any annexed part of Europe. If Germany captured, because partisans did play a factor in France, and partisans did play a factor in Yugoslavia, and parts of Russia. Partisans had a big impact in some of these places. So unless suppressed by 2 army units, partisans are generated, so that's a debatable term, in all annexed territories. So not all, because places are exceptions, could be like Austria if it's held by Germany, Bohemia, Slovakia, that kind of thing. So that would need some more clarification. Or built in annexed or neutral territory. So you could actually assist the French in freeing their nation by building them some partisans, by supplying them with some partisan units. It only costs, I think, $2, maybe $1. I think it's $1 actually to start a partisan unit. So you could throw them a partisan unit, and hopefully the French can utilize that and kind of overthrow the enemy a little bit by little bit. On all islands, coasts, or any territory adjacent to purchasing nations. So Britain it can't start a partisan unit in Paris. It's just not close enough to the coast. But it can start it on any adjacent to the coast, or any island, because that's adjacent to the coast. Or if it's adjacent to, say if Britain holds northern Greece, then it could start a partisan unit in Yugoslavia too, theoretically, right? That's the idea there, just cross-border stuff. Only 1 partisan may be built per faction, per round, per territory. So that means oopsie-daisy. Yeah. Okay, so that means the USA and Britain you can't put down 4 partisans into what's now known as Aquitaine. It used to be, Bordeaux, I think. So you can't put 4 partisans down in Bordeaux. Just way too much nonsense there. You have to only do 1 maximum. That's about as far as you can get. And so that's the idea behind this, right? And we'll explain what partisans do later on. Partisans in neutral nation activated. So this is how you spark a civil war. Nation becomes active, collects income, and is controlled by the best logical choice. That's a bit odd wording for a board game, right? Best logical choice. So Britain can start, and has started in one of our test games, a civil war, a 3-way civil war in Spain. It was the Nationalists, the Republicans, and the Democrats started, I believe it was in Leon Castile or something like that. Maybe it was down south. And they started a 3-way civil war. And it was interesting. It was a lot of fun. How it works. So in the case if Britain started a partisan uprising in say Argentina, you can do that. You can start it in Argentina. Then Argentina would become active and be controlled by the best logical choice. Now, does that mean it's Germany, or does that mean it's Soviets? Well, in that case, who's the best person? Maybe it's a joint decision between the two of them. Maybe it's not who controls it, but the decision is a joint decision by the Soviets and the Axis to defeat the partisan uprising. That's the idea behind that. Now, I do say it's controlled by the best logical choice. I didn't say best logical player, it's just the best logical choice to defeat the partisan uprising. So it has to actually make steps into overthrowing the uprising. So whatever that looks like, that's kind of up for debate between people. So that's what a partisan does. A partisan inclusion starts an uprising. 2 partisans may form into 1 militia and begin a civil war. So you go from stage 1 is partisans and uprising. and you can crush uprisings by suppressing it with 2 army units. I believe they have to be infantry or cavalry. And if you have 2 partisans, you can form them into a militia and begin a civil war. So you might want to wait until you have 4 partisans and then form into 2 militia and start a civil war. That's kind of the idea there. Or you might want to do 2 partisans and 1 militia and then start a civil war. You get the idea. Once it becomes a civil war, then of course it becomes open to Lend-Lease as well too, so you might want to do that if it's worth the risk. Moving on, dynamic supply. A territory or sea zone is in supply if it can trace a route to a homeland territory or a factory via land, rail, naval base, harbor, or in-supply naval transport. So transports can also provide supply to islands and such like that too. You know, they just have to be off the coast. Territories out of supply cannot build. They cannot build militia, they cannot build supply, whatever. They can't build anything. Navy units out of operational range of naval base instigate combat at penalty. You're out of naval base if you're out of 1 movement range out of a naval base. So if you're 4 zones away from a naval base, a friendly naval base, then you know, since in your transport, you're not in supply there. You have to be within 3 naval zones to be in supply. That's the idea there, which really forces the allied player to do kind of island hopping to get across the Pacific. And this worked quite successfully. So the penalty is for all units, land, sea, and I suppose air. First turn, -1 to attack and defense, and you become a POW, it should say 11 and 12, if you're out of supply. Well, it could just be 12 in this case, you know, I think that would work just as good too. Retreat is 11 and 12, but this POW at 12 works fine. Subsequent turns worsen penalty by 1. Now, the penalty, you know, is -1 to attack and defend, and POW at 11, and it would gradually get worse as time goes by. So you really want to stay in supply. An unsupplied territory can still supply as many units as its territory value plus 1. So it would be land units or air units that are in that territory. Partisans and militia are always in supply. So that means if a territory value is 2, we can supply 3 units in that territory. So you're still going to have a decent amount of supply for your land and any air units parked on land as well. So that's the idea behind that. This works quite well with island hopping and that kind of thing. It works famously, let's say. Okay, last little rule here. Generals and admirals. Commanders are gained at the beginning of each year. At the start of a nation's turn, each commander, at the start of a nation's turn, that should be a dash rather than a period. Half stop. Each commander has unique strengths and weaknesses that affect the attached force. Now, I came across in Axis and Allies forum some Italian kind of spreadsheet, I suppose it would be. It was written in Italian, but it just had the commanders, and each commander had something different. You know, that Rommel was, I think he had something where he could reroll 2 attack dice for tanks. Montgomery, he rolled defensively for 3 infantry or something along those lines. You get the picture. They had different benefits and downsides. For me, I don't like things that impact the dice too much, but yeah, at the end of the day, dice are the best way to conduct war, you know, battle it out. So I suppose other commanders could be, well, if you have this commander, you're in supply with, you know, 4 extra units or something like that. Maybe these guys don't get a penalty in supply. Maybe you'll have people like, who's the general that held out in Stalingrad? Perhaps he would stay in supply for 1 turn longer before he starts to suffer a penalty. Something like that, right? Something like that could work out. Commanders can command forces of mixed nationalities. You know, if you're a German commander, you could command German and Italian, using them as a united force on the commander's turn. So if it's a German commander, it has to be commanded on the Germans. Doing so expends the action of all units involved. Commanders move with any attached forces or can expend their turn to trace move path, that's a new way of moving, and attach to a different force. So you can move with attached units or you can move a different way. And the different way is this. The different way is, so in Global War 1936 version 2, they came up with a commander's expansion that your commanders can move 6 spaces. But again, we come across this whole issue of if 1 turn is 6 months, then that means the commander is moving across 1 territory every 6 months. Or you could rail him, of course, but say you're not railing him. He's moving across 1 territory a month. That means it's taking him, you know, one month to get across Yugoslavia. And again, keep in mind, a ship could sail faster than that. So basically, you could move your generals through a kind of a Lend-Lease form, where you just move them. As long as you could trace the path, you can move them that distance. So you can get them to where they want to go if they're not interdicted. Of course, they can move with attached forces, and that's much safer. But yeah, you could still do it this way. The commander is killed if all friendly units in a territory he's defending in, or whatever, even attacking in, I suppose, are destroyed, or if interdicted in an unattached movement where he's doing that trace path move. So that's the idea behind that. So commanders we could get into later on, but they have different features and stuff that a person can include. But yeah, we'll leave it at that. Now to round up the rest of the page, let's look at the order of play. I redid this quite a bit actually, and I'm still toying around with ins and outs of it, but I'm quite happy with how it looks. So Germany starts, why not? Now in this you have 5 different players. You have the Axis, ally number 2, ally number 1, I can't see that, alright. Then you have ally number 1 again, ally number 1, Axis, ally number 2, Communist, Axis, ally 2, ally 1, Communist. Okay, so that's what that's all about. Let's see if I can erase that. So you do have it minimum has to be, what is it, 5 players? 4 players. Minimum you have to play JX36 is 4 players. It doesn't work otherwise. You need 4 players. So Germany goes first. Germany is working through his turn, and the ally number 2 is like, hey, is it okay if I do the Chinese turn? Germany says, yeah, sure, why not? Germany has no impact on China, so go for it, knock yourself out. And Germany goes, right? Germany goes, and Nationalist China can start doing its turn, at least planning it out, right? Planning out what it wants to do. Then Britain goes. Now Britain looks over its shoulder at ally number 2, who's playing Nationalist China, says, hey, is it okay if I do my turn? And Nationalist China says, yeah, might as well. Germany might not be too happy about it. Germany has to be done before Britain starts theirs, but Nationalist China doesn't mind. So Britain starts its turn. Now South Africa is an optional player. It doesn't have to have its own nation. It can be included in Britain as well. You could roll it into this one. Same thing with Canada. You could roll it into that one if you want simplicity. Absolutely is possible. But Britain's doing its turn, and Britain is only the Atlantic theater. That's it. That's all. Atlantic and Africa. That's it. So Britain's chewing away through its turn. China's okay with it. Japan looks over at Britain and says, hey, is it okay if I start planning my turn? And Britain says, yeah, sure, why not? Nothing that you do is going to impact me. So now you have already, you see how it's set up. When one player goes, the other person's allowed to plan their turn. So Japan goes. Is France impeded, or is France going to impede Japan? No. So France can go. Is Britain going to impede Japan? No. So Japan can go. Is France impeded by Japan? No. Is France impeded by the Soviets? No. So might as well let the French go, and the Soviets can start planning their turn as well. Something like that. You get the idea behind that. Now when the Soviets go, France isn't being hurt by that. The Soviets over, and it's Italy's up next. So Italy can start planning its turn as well, because there's very little that Italy can do that can impact, Soviets can do that can impact Italy. There's some, but in the earlier stages of the war, and even in the mid stages, there's not going to be too much. So Italy goes, and Italy's turn is fairly quick. They don't have too much to think about, because the next one up is United States. Now, United States isn't in the war until, into the roughly the middle or late middle stage, and so they're not going to have too much going on for themselves. The KMT is up here, so they've already gone. Now, United States is just going to be doing some lend-lease here and there, and of course they have to wait for Italy to finish up, but for the most part, they can go ahead and start planning out what they want to do, because Italy's not going to impact things too drastically. And as United States goes, and then the Soviets are saying, the FEC is like, you know what, I may as well start my turn too. And USA says, yeah, as well, nothing I can do can impact you. And so the FEC goes ahead, as well as the Anzac, and then we're left with the Communists. Are the Communists going to impact the Anzac? No. Are they going to impact the FEC? I mean, maybe, but there's still the Anzac, so you have a bit of a buffer. Is Communists going to impact Germany? No. So realistically, at that point, you could already have the Germans planning out their turn. So what we have here is a system where when one player goes, it allows the other players kind of around them to already start preparing their turn. That, combined with what we had here with the delayed deployment of production, means that things theoretically could go a little bit quicker than they do in the base game. So even though this game adds all kinds of extra rules, there's other stuff that will counteract that. In Axis and Allies in Global War 36, you have Germany goes first, followed by the Soviets. Now, who's the Soviets' biggest enemy? Germany. So you have to wait till Germany finishes absolutely and places all their units before Soviets go, right? And then you have then you have Japan. Now, Japan's not impacted by the Soviets, I grant you that. But Japan has to do its turn, and then Britain, the FEC, Anzac, and all those go all together. So they have to wait till Japan is officially done their turn. Then it's Italy. Yeah, Italy has to wait until Britain officially 100% is finished with its turn. You know? Because there's things that will impact Italy, place unit and stuff like that. Italy's primary enemy is Britain, right? And now after Italy is USA, and that's what I have here as well, because there's only so many ways you can skin a cat. So here we have the United States show up next. So United States, well, they do have to wait till Italy's done, but at least it slims it down a little bit. And USA, if you're playing with, an extra allied player, ally number 3 or whatever, or however it is, if you split East and West a little bit and have 5 players or whatever, then the ally number 4 or 5, player number 4 or 5, ally number 3, could do his Eastern United States while the Western United States waits. That's another option to do, right? And then things kind of go along a little bit along the same vein. And so theoretically it speeds things up a little bit just by shifting the place order of units. Now, I understand why Axis and allies have it their way. Germany is the aggressor. He's the quickest moving one. So Germany first launched an attack into Poland, followed by an attack into France, right? Very quickly. And then the Soviets were the next kind of aggressor. They attacked Poland and gobbled up the rest of the territory. So I understand that. And then the British were the next aggressor, not aggressor, but reactor, let's say, right? So they go next. Global War 36 doesn't have that issue. They don't have that issue. There shouldn't be any reason that we're still copying Axis and allies with Global War 1936. We can change up the order if it speeds up gameplay. And I say speed up gameplay. Just from even this YouTube war thing, it's like, well, there's no point in doing the British turn until I see what the Japanese do or whatever, so I can do the FEC. You really have to wait 100%. There's no point in even planning it out until you see what everybody else prior to you has gone. That kind of thing. So that's a scoop behind that. That's why I organize this turn order in this way, and I'm sure there's some ways people can improve on it, but this is something to park a thought in your minds, and perhaps you can come up with a better solution. So this turn we learned about turn order, about supply. I think supply is really interesting. Uprisings. Uprisings is something that people can play that diplomatic game if they want to and do a few interesting things. There was this kind of stuff. There was partisans and uprisings and that kind of stuff existing during the course of World War II with Iraq, there's a few other ones I could probably think of. Iraq is one big one that we could think of there. Withdrawing and surrendering, sure, there was historically lots of withdrawals and retreats that were quite glorious and well done. Commanders, yeah, I think commanders are interesting. They have different benefits. Peacetime naval intent gets around kind of a gamey exploit that could be taken advantage of. Army and Navy units, I think that's kind of a natural progression, and when you get more into the dynamic air war type of stuff, you'll see this makes all kinds of sense. Contested territory, sure, if you have maximum combat rounds actually Global War 1936 didn't do it this way. In Global War 1914, rather, if you lose a battle, everybody bounces back to their starting positions. And that made it difficult for the Entente to really make any headway, because it felt like they kept having to cross those fortified lines and across those trenches each and every time just to do any damage, right? So that's the idea there, or for the Central Powers, rather. So yeah, and then the ship-based hopping rule, I think that makes sense to get things. It's my version of strategic naval movement, and I think it works quite a bit better, and I actually prefer this way over the other way. Delayed deployment of production, that's kind of a test phase thing. I think it works quite well. It definitely sped the game up where people didn't really park themselves and really think really, really hard. Actually, I had two outcomes. You had, 10% of the people really stop and think and try to guess, 3 turns ahead what they'll need. Then you had the people like me who are like, I can't, there's so many variables, there's no way you're going to guess. So you may as well just go with kind of a standard purchase that you'll only tweak slightly as you need to as time goes by. Victory points we covered, nothing new there. We've covered this turn phases, and dynamic air war we did not touch because that's a little bit too complex, and we can deal with that when we talk about aircraft themselves. Okay, thank you all for watching. Cheers.